There is a place in the American Southwest where summer is no longer a season, but a siege. For 4 months, and sometimes more, the sun rises over a vast basin of concrete and steel and turns the entire city into a slow furnace, an environment so relentlessly, dangerously hot that the ordinary business of being alive, of walking to a car, of waiting at a bus stop, of touching a metal railing or a seatbelt buckle becomes a genuine hazard. This is Phoenix, Arizona, the hottest major city in the United States, a sprawling metropolis of millions that has spent decades growing outward across the desert on the promise that technology could hold the heat at bay. And now, in this decade, a hard and uncomfortable question is being asked with increasing seriousness. Not just by scientists and activists, but by ordinary people who live there, and by the institutions that ensure and finance and govern the place. The question is whether America's hottest city is becoming a place that is almost impossible to live in. That phrase can sound like exaggeration, like the kind of dramatic language that gets attached to every heat wave and every hot summer. But the closer you look, the less it sounds like hyperbole, and the more it sounds like a sober description of a trajectory. Because the heat in Phoenix is not merely uncomfortable, and it is not merely getting a little worse each year in some gentle, manageable way. It is intensifying, lengthening, and hardening into a condition that presses against the outer limits of what human beings and human systems were built to withstand. The summers are hotter than they have ever been in the recorded history of the place. They last longer, starting earlier and ending later. The nights, which once offered the desert's only reliable relief, no longer cool the way they used to. And all of this is unfolding in a city whose entire existence depends on an unbroken chain of electricity and water and machinery, a chain that grows more strained with every record-breaking year. In this video, we are going to take an unflinching look at what is actually happening to America's hottest city and why the phrase almost impossible to live in has stopped being an insult and started becoming a warning. We are going to understand how a city came to exist in one of the most hostile environments on the continent and why that arrangement, which worked for so long, is now under threat. We are going to see what the heat does to the human body, to the infrastructure, to the water, and to the daily rhythm of life. We are going to meet the people the heat hunts first and hardest, and we are going to look at the quiet ways that extreme heat is beginning to reshape who can afford to stay and who is forced to leave. And we are going to confront the largest question of all, the one that hangs not just over Phoenix, but over every hot and growing city in a warming world. What happens when a place that millions call home crosses the line from difficult to survive to genuinely unlivable? Stay with us, because this is not a distant, hypothetical future. It is a present tense story unfolding right now in the searing air of the Arizona desert, and what happens there is a preview of what may be coming for many more. Hashtag the city that was never supposed to work to understand how America's hottest city could be sliding toward the impossible. You first have to understand the sheer audacity of its existence, because Phoenix was, in a very real sense, never supposed to work. It sits in the Sonoran Desert, one of the hottest and driest landscapes on the North American continent, in a low, broad valley ringed by bare mountains, in a place where the natural conditions are actively hostile to large-scale human habitation. This is a land of raw, punishing sun, of ground that bakes for months on end, of an atmosphere so dry that the moisture is pulled from everything, and of a summer heat so intense that for most of human history, no great city could have survived there. The desert was not a blank canvas waiting to be filled. It was and remains an environment at the far edge of what human beings can endure. And yet a city rose there anyway, and not a small one. Over the modern era, Phoenix grew from a modest desert settlement into one of the largest and fastest-growing metropolitan areas in the entire United States, a vast expanse of homes and highways and businesses spreading across the valley floor. Millions of people came, drawn by sunshine and space and opportunity, by the promise of a life in a place of endless blue skies and warm winters. The city sprawled outward in every direction, low and wide, its subdivisions and shopping centers and parking lots covering the desert in an ever-expanding footprint. It became a symbol of a certain kind of American ambition, the belief that with enough ingenuity and energy, human beings could master even the most forbidding environment and bend it to their will. The key that unlocked all of this, the single technology without which none of it would have been possible, was air conditioning. It is difficult to overstate how completely the modern desert city depends on the ability to create cool, controlled indoor environments while the world outside blazes. Air conditioning is what made it possible for millions of people to live and work and sleep in a place where the outdoor temperature in summer regularly climbs to levels that would be unbearable and eventually lethal without relief. It transformed the desert from a place people passed through into a place people could inhabit in enormous numbers. Every home, every office, every store, every school became a cooled refuge, an artificial climate maintained against the natural one, and the city as a whole became a kind of vast distributed machine for keeping the heat outside. But here is the vulnerability hidden at the heart of that triumph, the flaw that has always been present and that is only now becoming fully visible. The entire arrangement rests on a set of assumptions, and the most important of those assumptions is that the heat outside will remain within certain bounds, the bounds the city was designed to handle. Phoenix was built for a hot climate, yes, but for a particular hot climate, one whose extremes, however brutal, were survivable with the technology available and whose demands the infrastructure could meet. The city was built on the bet that the future would resemble the past, that the summers of tomorrow would be roughly like the summers of yesterday. And that bet is exactly what the heat of this decade has called into question. Because the climate is no longer what it was when the city made its bargain with the desert. The heat is climbing, the summers are lengthening, and the assumptions that the whole precarious arrangement rested upon are beginning to fail. The city that was never supposed to work is now discovering just how narrow the margin always was. Hashtag, what hottest really means now we call Phoenix America's hottest city, and it is easy to let that phrase slide past as a simple superlative, a fact about geography, no more alarming than the tallest mountain or the longest river. But it is worth stopping to understand what hottest actually means in practice now, because the reality behind the label has changed, and it has changed for the worse in ways that the familiar phrase does not capture. When people say Phoenix is the hottest major city in the country, they are pointing at something that has become far more extreme and far more dangerous than the reputation suggests. For generations, the heat in Phoenix was defined by its daytime peaks, by how high the temperature climbed in the middle of a summer afternoon. And those peaks were always formidable, reaching heights that people from cooler climates find genuinely hard to imagine, the kind of heat that makes the air shimmer and the pavement dangerous to touch. But in recent years, the daytime peaks have pushed higher still, into territory that ranks among the most extreme ever reliably recorded for the city, exceeding the old marks not by trivial amounts, but by meaningful margins, and doing so more often. The hottest days are hotter than they used to be, and there are more of them, so that the very worst of the heat, which once arrived as an occasional brutal spike, now arrives again and again across the long summer. But the daytime peaks are only part of the story, and in many ways they are not even the most important part. What has changed most consequentially is the duration and the persistence of the heat. The summers now begin earlier, with dangerous temperatures arriving before people expect them, and they end later, with the punishing heat lingering into the months that used to bring relief. And within the summer, the extreme heat comes in longer and longer runs, in streaks that stretch on for weeks at a time, day after day of scorching temperatures with no meaningful break. Where once a stretch of the very hottest days would have been a notable event, the city now endures extended sieges of extreme heat, unbroken periods in which the temperature climbs to punishing highs again and again with no relief in sight. The heat has become less an event and more a condition, a state of being that settles over the city and refuses to lift. And then there are the nights, which may be the single most important and least appreciated dimension of what hottest means now. For as long as people have lived in the desert, the one reliable mercy of the climate was that the night brought cooling. However brutal the day, the darkness would bring the temperature down, offering a period of relief in which bodies could recover and buildings could shed their accumulated heat. That nightly cooling was not a luxury. It was the mechanism that made desert life survivable. But now, the nights are failing to cool the way they once did. The overnight low temperatures have climbed to record levels, so that the heat never fully releases its grip, even in the deepest hours before dawn. This is what hottest really means now. Not just higher peaks, but longer summers, longer streaks, and hotter nights. A heat that has expanded in every dimension at once, becoming more intense, more persistent, and more relentless than the simple label of hottest city can convey. Hashtag the summer that refuses to end. One of the cruelest transformations in America's hottest city is the way the summer has stretched and swollen until it dominates the calendar, devouring the shoulder seasons and turning what was once a period of intense but bounded heat into something that feels almost endless. This lengthening of the hot season is one of the clearest signs that the city is sliding toward the unlivable, because it is not simply about how hot the hottest day gets. It is about how much of the year is now given over to conditions that are dangerous, exhausting, and confining, and about how little of the year is left for anything else. There was a time when the residents of the desert city could count on a rhythm, a difficult summer followed by many months of genuinely pleasant weather, the warm winters and mild springs and autumns that were, for many, the whole reason to live there in the first place. The heat was a price to be paid, a hard season to be endured, but it was a season, with a beginning and an end. That rhythm was the bargain, the trade that made the extreme summer worthwhile. But that rhythm is breaking down. The heat now arrives earlier in the spring, the dangerous temperatures showing up in months that used to be comfortable, and it lingers later into the fall, refusing to release its grip long after the summer should have ended. The pleasant seasons are being squeezed from both sides, compressed into ever shorter windows, while the oppressive heat expands to fill more and more of the year. The consequences of this lengthening are profound, and they reach into every corner of daily life. The longer the dangerous heat lasts, the longer people must stay confined indoors, retreating into their cooled refuges and venturing out only when necessary. The outdoor life that is supposed to be one of the great pleasures of the desert, the hiking and the recreation and the simple enjoyment of being outside, becomes impossible or hazardous for a larger and larger portion of the year. Children cannot play outside. The elderly cannot walk. The freedom to be out in the world without risk shrinks to a narrow band of months at either end of the long hot season. The lengthening summer does not just add days of heat, it subtracts days of livability. There is also a cumulative, wearing quality to a summer that refuses to end, a psychological and physical toll that builds as the weeks of relentless heat drag on. A short season of extreme heat can be endured with the knowledge that relief is coming, that the calendar will turn and the temperatures will break, but a heat that arrives early and stays late, that grinds on month after month with no end in sight, wears people down in a different way. It becomes a kind of siege, a long confinement, a test of endurance that stretches the reserves of both bodies and spirits. The summer that refuses to end is not just a longer version of the summer that always was. It is a qualitatively different burden. And it is one of the most powerful forces pushing America's hottest city toward the edge of what can be endured. Hashtag, when the body cannot keep up beneath all the talk of records and streaks and lengthening seasons lies the most fundamental fact of all, the reason the heat matters so much, which is that the human body has hard physical limits when it comes to enduring extreme heat. And America's hottest city is increasingly pushing against those limits. However much we build and adapt and cool, we remain biological creatures with a narrow range of internal temperatures compatible with life, and when the environment grows hot enough, sustained enough, and relentless enough, the body can lose the battle to keep itself cool, and the consequences can be swift and deadly. The human body is constantly generating heat simply by being alive, and it must continuously shed that heat to keep its core temperature within the narrow band it requires. In moderate conditions, this is easy, because the surrounding environment readily absorbs the excess. But as the air climbs toward and beyond the temperature of the body itself, shedding heat becomes progressively harder. Because heat naturally flows from hotter to cooler, and when the air is as hot as or hotter than the skin, that flow slows or reverses. In these conditions, the body's main defense is sweating. the evaporation of moisture from the skin that carries heat away. In the dry desert air of Phoenix, sweating remains effective for longer than it would in a humid climate, which is one reason the city has been survivable at all. But sweating comes at a steep cost, depleting the body of water and salts and driving it toward dangerous dehydration. And when the heat is extreme and sustained enough, even the desert body's sweating cannot keep up. When the body loses that battle and its core temperature begins to rise, the danger escalates quickly. Because the human body can tolerate only a few degrees of increase in its core temperature before serious harm sets in. The early stages of heat illness bring weakness, dizziness, nausea, and cramps, the body's warning signs that it is struggling to cope. If the heat stress continues and the core temperature keeps climbing, the situation can progress to heat stroke, the most severe and life-threatening form of heat illness, in which the body's temperature regulation collapses entirely. In heat stroke, the core temperature soars to catastrophic heights, the cooling mechanisms fail, and the organs in the brain begin to suffer damage. Without rapid cooling and medical care, heat stroke kills, and it can kill quickly, in a matter of hours or even less. This is not a rare or exotic danger in America's hottest city. It is a present and growing threat that stalks the summer streets. What makes the heat so insidious is the way it accumulates and the way it preys on the vulnerable. The danger is not only in a single blistering afternoon, but in the relentless, day after day, night after night exposure of a prolonged heat wave, which wears down the body's reserves without giving them a chance to recover, especially when the nights no longer cool. Heat strains the heart and the circulatory system, worsens a wide range of existing medical conditions, and pushes vulnerable people into crisis in ways that are often quiet and hidden. And crucially, the effects build over the length of a heat wave, so that the danger grows the longer the extreme conditions persist. This is why the lengthening summers and the record-breaking streaks and the warm nights are so lethal in combination, because together they subject the body to unbroken heat stress over longer and longer periods, pushing more and more people past the limit of what their bodies can endure. When the body cannot keep up, the city's reputation as merely hot reveals its true face as something far more dangerous, a place where the environment itself has become capable of killing. Hashtag the deadliest disaster nobody sees. When we think of the natural disasters that make a place dangerous, we picture dramatic, violent events. The hurricanes and floods and fires that arrive with fury and leave visible destruction. But in America's hottest city, the deadliest disaster is none of these. It is the heat itself, and it kills more people than the storms and the floods combined. Yet it does so in a way so quiet and so hidden that many people do not even recognize it as a disaster at all. Understanding this silent, invisible killer is essential to grasping why the city is becoming so difficult to live in. Because the danger is not an occasional catastrophe, but a steady, rising toll woven into the fabric of every summer. The reason heat is so deadly and yet so invisible has everything to do with the way it kills. A hurricane strikes in a single unmistakable event, its damage concentrated and dramatic and impossible to ignore. But heat kills gradually and individually, often behind closed doors, taking its victims one by one across the long weeks of summer in ways that produce no dramatic images and draw no crowds. A person overcome by heat may die alone in a sweltering apartment where the cooling failed. An elderly resident whose air conditioning broke down. There is no wreckage to photograph, just a quiet accumulation of deaths spread across the season. Because these deaths are dispersed and undramatic, they do not command the attention that the more visible disasters receive, and so the true scale of the danger is chronically underappreciated, even as it grows. In America's hottest city, the toll of heat has climbed as the temperatures have climbed, and the record-breaking summers have brought record-breaking numbers of heat-related deaths. Each severe summer sees a grim count of lives lost, people who succumbed to heat illness, whose existing conditions were pushed past the breaking point, who were caught without adequate cooling. These are not abstract statistics. They are human beings, individuals with lives and families and stories, whose deaths were caused, directly or indirectly, by the extreme heat that now defines the desert summer. And the trend has been upward, the numbers growing as the heat has intensified. The heat is not a background nuisance in this city. It is the leading weather-related killer, and its toll is mounting. What makes this especially tragic and especially relevant to the question of livability is that heat deaths are, in principle, largely preventable. Unlike some disasters that strike without warning and overwhelm any possible defense, heat kills in ways that can often be avoided with adequate cooling, hydration, and care, particularly for the most vulnerable. A person with reliable air conditioning, access to cool water, and a safe environment can survive even extreme heat. The deaths, overwhelmingly, happen when those protections fail, when the cooling breaks down or was never available in the first place. This means the rising toll is not simply an unavoidable act of nature. It is, to a significant degree, a failure of protection, a sign that the systems and safety nets meant to shield people from the heat are being overwhelmed by conditions more extreme than they were designed to handle. And as the heat intensifies, the margin of protection grows thinner, and the deadliest disaster nobody sees claims more and more of those the city cannot keep cool. Hashtag the price of staying cool. If the heat in America's hottest city can be survived only behind cooled walls, then a hard economic reality follows immediately, one that is central to the question of whether the city is becoming impossible to live in. Survival now depends on the ability to pay for cooling, and the price of staying cool is rising, turning what was once a background cost of desert life into a growing burden that presses hardest on those who can least afford it. In a place where air conditioning is not a comfort, but a lifeline, the cost of running that lifeline becomes, quite literally, the cost of staying alive. The mechanics of this are straightforward and unforgiving. The hotter it gets and the longer the heat lasts, the more cooling is required to keep an indoor space safe. And the more cooling is required, the more electricity is consumed, and the higher the bills climb. As the summers lengthen and intensify, the cooling systems must run harder and longer for more months of the year, generating larger and larger utility bills. For a household, the essential act of keeping the home survivable through the summer becomes an ever greater expense, a cost that grows in lockstep with the heat. The bargain of desert living always included the cost of cooling, but that cost is escalating as the climate shifts, and for many households it is becoming a serious financial strain. For those living on the margins, this rising price of survival is genuinely dangerous. A household struggling to make ends meet may face an impossible choice between paying the cooling bill and paying for other necessities, and some may be forced to ration their cooling, setting the thermostat higher than is safe or running the air conditioning less than they need to, simply because they cannot afford the full cost. Others may live in older or poorly built housing where the cooling is inadequate or the equipment is inefficient, so that they pay high bills and still cannot keep their homes truly safe. And when the cooling fails, when an aging unit breaks down and there is no money to repair it, the consequences can be lethal. The rising price of staying cool means that protection against the heat is increasingly distributed according to wealth, and those with the least are left most exposed. This economic dimension is one of the most important and least visible ways that America's hottest city is becoming harder to live in, because it transforms the heat from a shared environmental challenge into a driver of inequality and hardship. The wealthy can afford whatever cooling they need and keep their environment safe no matter how high the temperatures climb. But for the poor and the working class, the escalating cost of cooling eats into already stretched budgets, forces dangerous compromises, and adds a heavy financial weight to the physical burden of the heat. The question of whether the city is livable is, for a great many of its residents, inseparable from the question of whether they can afford to keep the heat at bay. And that question is getting harder to answer with every passing year. Hashtag the water running out beneath it. The heat in America's hottest city does not act alone. It is bound up with another slow-moving crisis, one that compounds the danger and deepens the question of livability. And that is the crisis of water. A desert city is, by definition, a place of scarcity when it comes to water, a settlement that exists only because water has been gathered and delivered from sources that the local environment cannot naturally provide. And now, as the heat intensifies, the water that sustains the city is coming under growing strain, so that the two crises, heat and water, feed upon each other in ways that make both worse and that together threaten the very foundation of desert life. The relationship between the heat and the water is direct and vicious. Extreme heat drives up the demand for water even as it makes water harder to keep. In the searing conditions of a record-breaking summer, people need more water to stay hydrated and to cope. And the systems that help cool the city, from the vegetation that provides shade to various forms of cooling, all consume water. At the same time, the heat itself accelerates the loss of water through evaporation, pulling moisture from reservoirs, from the soil, from every exposed surface, so that more water is lost to the air even as more is demanded. The hotter it gets, the thirstier the city and the surrounding landscape become. Heat and water scarcity are not separate problems. They are two faces of the same warming, drying shift, and each makes the other harder to bear. And the region's water supply was already under enormous pressure before the recent heat made everything worse. The great rivers and reservoirs that help sustain the desert cities of the Southwest have been drawn down by long-term drought and heavy use, falling to alarming lows and raising real questions about their future reliability. The groundwater that supplements these sources is being pumped in many places faster than it can be naturally replenished, drawing down a finite reserve that took ages to accumulate. Into this already precarious situation comes the intensifying heat, adding its own demands and accelerating the losses, tightening the squeeze on a water supply that was stretched thin to begin with. The city depends on water arriving reliably from sources that are themselves increasingly uncertain. And the same warming that drives the heat is undermining those sources at the same time. This entanglement of heat and water reveals the deep predicament of America's hottest city. The city depends on both a reliable supply of water and a reliable supply of power to survive in its extreme environment, and both are threatened by the same fundamental warming. A hotter climate means more heat to endure and less water to endure it with, a double bind that grows tighter as the temperatures climb. The city's ability to cool itself, to keep its people hydrated, to sustain the greenery that provides shade and relief, all depend on water, and the water is growing scarcer even as the need for it grows greater. The heat is not an isolated problem, but part of a web of interlocking crises. Heat and water and power, all bound together, all pressured by the same warming, all pushing the desert city closer to the limits of what it can sustain. The water running out beneath it is not a separate story from the heat pressing down upon it. They are the same story. #The city that makes its own heat there is a further cruel twist to the story of America's hottest city, one that turns the metropolis from a mere victim of the desert climate into an active author of its own suffering. It is a phenomenon known as the urban heat island, and it means that the sprawling city itself generates and traps additional heat, layering a human-made warmth on top of the natural desert heat and pushing the temperatures even higher, especially at night. This is one of the most important pieces of the puzzle, because it explains why the built-up city has grown so much hotter than the surrounding desert, and why the growth that made the city great has also made it more dangerous. The mechanism is straightforward once you understand it. A natural desert landscape, for all its heat, has features that allow it to shed warmth, radiating heat back to the sky at night, so that the open desert cools substantially after dark. But a city is different. It is built of concrete and asphalt, and steel and glass. Materials that absorb enormous amounts of the sun's heat during the day, and then release it slowly through the night. The vast expanses of dark pavement, the endless roads and parking lots, the buildings packed together, all of them soak up solar energy hour after hour, storing it like a battery, and then radiating it back long after the sun has set. The result is that the city stays hot when the desert around it cools, and the difference can be dramatic, with the built-up areas remaining many degrees warmer than the open land nearby. Phoenix, as one of the most sprawling cities in the country, is a nearly perfect machine for generating an urban heat island. Its endless expanse of low buildings, wide roads, and enormous parking lots represents a vast surface area of heat-absorbing material, all of it soaking up the desert sun and releasing it back into the air. The more the city has grown, the stronger the heat island effect has become. This is a crucial and troubling point, because it means that part of the record-breaking heat is a direct consequence of the city's own growth and design. As the metropolis expanded, it did not just place more people in a hot desert. It actively made the local environment hotter, replacing the cooling desert ground with heat-trapping surfaces on an enormous scale, so that the very act of building the city intensified the heat the city must now endure. The urban heat island is especially powerful at night, and this is where it connects directly to the failure of the nights to cool. During the day, the difference between the city and the desert may be modest, because both are blasted by the same intense sun. But at night, when the natural desert cools rapidly by radiating its heat to the sky, the city cannot cool the same way. Because all that concrete and asphalt is still releasing the heat it absorbed during the day. The stored warmth keeps the urban air hot long into the night, preventing the overnight temperatures from dropping the way they once did. In this way, the growth of the city has directly contributed to the loss of the nighttime relief that once made desert life bearable, compounding the effects of the broader warming and helping to drive the overnight lows to record heights. The city, in a very real sense, has become a co-author of its own heat crisis. When the grid is pushed to the edge if there is one thing that stands between the people of America's hottest city and the full lethal force of the desert heat. It is the vast infrastructure of cooling that keeps the indoor world livable, and above all it is the supply of electricity that powers that cooling. Air conditioning is not a comfort in Phoenix. It is a lifeline, the essential technology that makes the city habitable, and it runs on electricity. This means that the survival of the entire metropolis depends, in the most literal sense, on the reliable flow of power to run the cooling systems, and as the heat has climbed to record breaking levels, the strain on that lifeline has grown to unprecedented proportions, raising the terrifying question of what happens if the grid is ever pushed past the edge. The relationship between extreme heat and electricity demand is direct and powerful. As the temperatures climb, more and more cooling is required to keep indoor spaces safe, and the cooling systems must work harder and run longer to hold the heat at bay. Across the entire city, in millions of homes and businesses, the air conditioners run and run, drawing enormous amounts of power, and the total demand on the electrical grid climbs to staggering heights during the worst of the heat. The record-breaking temperatures drive record-breaking demand for electricity, as the cooling systems strain to keep up with conditions more extreme than they were ever designed to handle. And crucially, the record-breaking warm nights mean that the demand does not fall off after dark the way it once did, because the cooling must continue around the clock when the night no longer brings relief. The grid, built with certain assumptions about the peaks of demand and the recovery of the nights, is pushed to its limits by heat that defies those assumptions. This enormous and growing demand places tremendous stress on the entire system that generates and delivers electricity. The power plants must produce more, the transmission lines must carry more, the equipment must handle loads at the edge of its capacity, all in conditions of extreme heat that make the machinery itself work harder and less efficiently. Extreme heat can reduce the efficiency of power generation and transmission even as it drives up demand, a dangerous combination that squeezes the system from both ends. Most of the time, the grid operators succeed, and the power keeps flowing, and the cooling keeps running, and the city endures the heat behind its cooled walls. But the margin grows thinner as the heat grows more extreme, and the entire arrangement depends on the grid continuing to hold under ever-increasing strain. And this is where we arrive at the scenario that haunts the people who plan for these things, the nightmare that lurks behind every record-breaking summer. What happens if the power fails during an extreme heat wave? Imagine a prolonged, record-breaking heat event gripping the city, and then imagine that, at the peak of it, the grid fails and the power goes out across a large part of the city and stays out for an extended period. Without electricity, the air conditioning stops, and the cooled indoor environments that millions depend on begin immediately to heat up. In extreme outdoor conditions, an unpowered building does not stay cool for long. The heat seeps in, the interiors that were sanctuaries become dangerous in their own right, and with the warm nights offering no relief, there would be no period in which people and buildings could recover. A large population, suddenly deprived of the cooling on which their survival depends, exposed to extreme heat around the clock, would face a mass casualty event of a kind rarely seen, and studies that have modeled such scenarios have reached genuinely sobering conclusions about the potential loss of life. This is the fragility that lies beneath the surface of America's hottest city, which functions well but only as long as the power flows, so that the more extreme the heat becomes, the higher the stakes of any failure grow. The heat that discriminates the burden of extreme heat does not fall evenly across America's hottest city. It presses hardest on certain people, seeking out the vulnerable, the exposed, and the unprotected, and understanding who the heat hunts first reveals a great deal about why the city is becoming impossible to live in, and for whom. In many ways, extreme heat is a disaster that discriminates, striking those who have the fewest defenses against it, so that the same record-breaking temperatures that are merely uncomfortable for the fortunate become genuinely life-threatening for those without the means to protect themselves. The question of livability, in other words, has different answers for different people. And for the most vulnerable, the answer is already becoming no. Among the most vulnerable are the elderly, whose bodies are less able to regulate temperature and cope with heat stress, and who are more likely to have the underlying health conditions that extreme heat can push into crisis. An older person, particularly one living alone, can be especially at risk, unable to recognize or respond to the danger, dependent on cooling systems that may fail. Isolated in a way that means no one may notice the peril until it is too late. The heat seeks out the old and the frail, whose defenses against it are weakest, and it claims them in disproportionate numbers, so that, for a growing population of aging residents, the intensifying summers pose a mounting and personal threat. The poor, too, are hunted first by the heat, because the ability to stay cool in an extreme environment costs money, and those who lack resources are exposed to danger that the wealthy can more easily avoid. Air conditioning requires equipment that must be bought and maintained, and electricity that must be paid for, and for people living on the margins, these costs can be prohibitive. A person who cannot afford to run their cooling, or whose home lacks adequate cooling entirely, is left exposed to the full force of the heat, and the record-breaking warm nights mean there is no longer any relief even after dark. The cruel arithmetic of the modern desert is that survival increasingly depends on the ability to pay for cooling, and those who cannot pay are left in the most danger. In this way, the heat crisis is also a crisis of inequality, its deadliest effects concentrated among those with the least, so that the city becomes unlivable first for the people who can least afford to leave. Then there are those whose circumstances expose them directly to the heat, with no walls to hide behind at all. People experiencing homelessness are among the most acutely vulnerable of all, living outdoors in an environment that has become lethally hot, with little or no access to cooling, water, or shelter from the sun. For someone living on the streets in the depth of a record-breaking summer, the heat is a constant, inescapable threat. And there are the outdoor workers, the construction workers, the landscapers, the delivery drivers, and countless others who cannot simply retreat indoors, who must endure hours of exposure in the course of earning their living. These workers face serious risk of heat illness, pushing their bodies to the limit in conditions that grow more dangerous with each record-breaking year. The heat hunts the exposed, the outdoor laborers, and the unhoused, whose lives leave them no refuge from the burning air. The uncomfortable truth is that America's hottest city is not becoming equally impossible for everyone at once. It is becoming impossible from the bottom up, unlivable first for the vulnerable and the poor and the exposed, while the fortunate can still, for now, buy their way to safety. The quiet exodus and the question of value for most of its modern history, America's hottest city was a place people moved toward, one of the great destinations of American migration, a magnet drawing newcomers by the hundreds of thousands with the promise of sunshine and affordability and opportunity. That powerful inflow of people was the engine of the city's extraordinary growth, and for a long time it seemed unstoppable, a permanent feature of the desert metropolis. But the intensifying heat is beginning, quietly and at the margins, to complicate that story, raising a question that would once have seemed unthinkable. What happens to a city built on the promise of endless growth when the environment itself begins to make people reconsider whether they want to stay? It is important not to overstate this, because the city continues to grow, and the forces drawing people to it remain strong. But beneath the surface, the extreme heat is beginning to weigh on the calculations that individuals and families and institutions make about the desert city. For some residents, the lengthening, intensifying summers are becoming a reason to think about leaving, a factor in decisions about where to build a life, retire, or raise children. The outdoor lifestyle that was once a major draw is being eroded, and the growing danger and cost of the summers are entering into people's sense of whether the place is where they want to be for the long term. This is not a mass departure, not an exodus in the dramatic sense, but a slow, quiet shift in the balance of considerations, a weight on one side of the scale that did not used to be there. More consequential, perhaps, than the decisions of individuals are the calculations of the institutions that underpin the value and viability of a place, the systems of insurance and finance and long-term investment that determine whether a city remains a sound place to build and own and lend. As the risks associated with extreme heat and the intertwined dangers of water scarcity and grid strain become more apparent, these institutions begin, slowly, to take them into account. The long-term risks of a warming climate can affect how a place is insured, how it is financed, and how its future is valued, and while these effects may be gradual and hard to see, they represent a profound potential shift in the foundations of the city's prosperity. A place whose fundamental livability comes into question is a place whose long-term value comes into question. This is where the phrase almost impossible to live in acquires its deepest meaning, because livability is not only a matter of physical survival, but of whether a place remains somewhere people want to be and are willing to invest in for the long haul. A city can remain technically survivable, its residents able to endure the summers behind their cooled walls, and yet begin to lose the thing that made it thrive, the confidence that it is a good place to build a future. If the heat continues to intensify, if the water grows scarcer and the costs climb higher and the risks mount, then the quiet reconsideration now happening at the margins could grow into something larger, a genuine shift in the trajectory of the desert metropolis. The exodus, if it comes, will not likely arrive as a sudden flight, but as a slow erosion, a gradual tilting of the balance, as more and more people and institutions conclude that the bargain of desert living is no longer worth the price. That is the quiet, creeping form that impossible can take, not a single dramatic moment of collapse, but a steady draining away of the value and the vitality that a great city depends upon. Hashtag the fight to stay livable faced with heat that threatens lives, strains every system, and raises questions about its very future. America's hottest city has not simply surrendered. The city and its people have mounted a determined and increasingly sophisticated fight to remain livable, developing new strategies, new technologies, and new institutions dedicated to helping the metropolis survive and adapt to conditions more extreme than it has ever faced. This effort is one of the most important dimensions of the whole story, because it represents the human response to the crisis, and it offers both real hope and a sober lesson about how much adaptation can and cannot achieve. One of the most fundamental tools in the fight is the network of places where people can go to escape the heat, the cooling centers and refuges that provide air-conditioned safety to those who lack it at home. When the temperatures climb to dangerous levels, these centers become genuine lifesavers, offering a cool place to rest, water to drink, and shelter from the lethal outdoor conditions. Expanding this network, making sure people know about it and can reach it, and keeping it open during the times of greatest danger, including the increasingly warm nights, is one of the most direct ways to save lives. The city has also taken the remarkable step of creating dedicated institutions and officials focused specifically on the threat of heat, a recognition that extreme heat has become a serious enough danger to warrant its own coordinated response, much as other hazards have long had. Beyond these responses, the city has pursued a range of strategies aimed at reducing the heat itself, at cooling the urban environment to counteract the heat island effect and make the metropolis more bearable. These efforts include experimenting with technologies and materials designed to reflect more of the sun's energy rather than absorbing it, such as special coatings applied to pavement to keep it cooler, and rethinking the design of buildings and public spaces to reduce the accumulation of heat. They include efforts to provide more shade, to shield people from the direct assault of the sun as they move through the city, and they include a growing recognition of the importance of vegetation, of trees and green spaces that can cool the environment naturally and provide relief from the heat. Each of these strategies represents an attempt to reshape the physical fabric of the city to make it cooler, to undo some of the heat-trapping design that intensified the urban heat island in the first place. But the distribution of trees and shade across the city is not even. And this connects to the deeper inequities of the heat. In many cities, including this one, the wealthier neighborhoods tend to have more trees, more green space, and more shade, while the poorer neighborhoods, often the very places where the most vulnerable people live, tend to have far less, leaving them hotter and more exposed. This uneven distribution means that the heat is not experienced equally across the city, and that the difference tracks, all too often, with wealth and disadvantage. Recognizing this, efforts to expand the tree canopy and bring shade to the city have increasingly focused on equity, on directing the planting of trees and the creation of shade toward the neighborhoods that need it most. The fight to stay livable is thus not only a fight against the heat, but a fight against the inequality that shapes who suffers from it, and both battles must be won together. Hashtag the limits of what adaptation can do for all the ingenuity of the human response. For all the cooling centers and the shade and the reflective pavement, there is a hard and sobering truth that must be confronted. A truth that lies at the very center of the question of whether America's hottest city is becoming impossible to live in. Adaptation has limits. There is only so much that even the most determined and resourceful city can do to hold back a climate that keeps growing more extreme, and if the heat continues to intensify without bound, then at some point the adaptations, however clever, may no longer be enough. To understand the true stakes of the crisis, we have to reckon honestly with the possibility that there is a ceiling to what human beings and human cities can endure, and that the heat is pushing ever closer to it. The human body, as we have seen, has physical limits to what it can endure. While the dry desert heat is more survivable than humid heat because sweating remains effective, there are still thresholds beyond which even the healthiest body cannot cope for long. The extreme dry heat carries its own lethal potential, and the combination of record-breaking temperatures with any increase in humidity, such as during the seasonal shifts in the desert weather, can push conditions toward genuinely dangerous territory. The point is that the human body is not infinitely adaptable, that there is a real ceiling to what it can withstand, and that the intensifying heat is pushing conditions closer to that ceiling. No amount of behavioral adjustment can change the fundamental biology, and when the environment grows hot enough, the only refuge is artificial cooling. Cities, too, have limits to their ability to adapt, limits set by the physical realities of the technologies and systems on which they depend. Air conditioning can hold the heat at bay, but only as long as the power flows. Cooling can be expanded, shade can be increased, refuges can be provided, but all of these responses have costs and constraints. And all of them ultimately depend on the availability of resources, of water and energy and money, that are themselves under pressure in a warming, drying world. There may come a point at which the heat rises faster than the adaptations can keep pace, at which the cost and the difficulty of maintaining a livable environment grows so great that the fundamental viability of the city comes into question. Adaptation can buy time and save lives, and it is essential, but it is not unlimited. And the intensifying heat raises the specter of a future in which the limits of adaptation are tested as never before. This confrontation with the limits is not a reason for despair, but it is a reason for a clear-eyed reckoning with the trajectory of the heat and the choices it presents. If the temperatures continue to climb, if the records continue to fall, if the summers grow ever longer and more extreme, then the question of how much heat the city can endure will move from the abstract to the urgent. America's hottest city is testing, in real time, the boundaries of what human beings can do in the face of extreme heat, and the outcome of that test will determine whether the phrase almost impossible to live in remains a warning or becomes a description of reality. Hashtag a warning for a warming nation. It would be comforting to think of America's hottest city as a special case, an extreme outlier whose troubles are unique to its particular location in the desert and therefore of little relevance to the rest of the country. But that comfort would be false, and dangerously so, because the story unfolding in Phoenix is not an isolated one. It is a preview, an early and intense version of a challenge that is coming, in different forms and to different degrees. For a great many cities across the nation and around the world, America's hottest city is a bellwether, a place where the future of extreme heat is arriving first and most forcefully, and what happens there carries lessons far beyond the borders of the Sonoran Desert. The reason is that the forces driving the crisis in Phoenix are not unique to Phoenix. The broad warming of the climate that is loading the dice toward more extreme heat is a global phenomenon. The urban heat island effect operates in every major city, wherever concrete and asphalt and buildings replace natural land, so that cities everywhere run hotter than their surroundings and cool less at night. The strain that extreme heat places on power grids and water supplies is a challenge that any city can face when the temperatures climb and the demand for cooling soars. And the way that heat preys on the vulnerable, the elderly, the poor, the unhoused, and the outdoor workers is a pattern that repeats wherever extreme heat strikes. Phoenix is experiencing these forces in their most concentrated form, but the forces themselves are spreading, and other cities, including many that have never thought of themselves as hot, are beginning to encounter versions of the same dangers. This is what makes America's hottest city so important to understand and to watch. It is a natural laboratory for the future of heat, a place where the problems that other cities will face in the years to come are already being confronted at full intensity. The ways that Phoenix succeeds or fails in adapting, in protecting its people, and managing the strain on its infrastructure and its water will offer hard-won lessons for everyone else. If the hottest city can find ways to remain livable in the face of extreme heat, those solutions may help other cities prepare. And if it cannot, then that too is a warning, a sign of what may lie ahead for other places as the warming continues and the extreme heat spreads. The fate of the desert metropolis is not a distant curiosity. It is a glimpse of a future that is coming for many. Hashtag the choice that remains. So we return, at the end, to the question that has hung over this entire story. Is America's hottest city becoming impossible to live in? The honest answer is that it stands at a genuine crossroads, closer to that threshold than at any point in its history, and moving toward it with every record-breaking summer, but not yet across it, and not yet without the power to change its course. The heat is intensifying, the summers are lengthening, the nights are failing to cool, the water is growing scarcer, the costs are climbing, and the vulnerable are being pushed to the edge and beyond. All of this is real, and all of it is getting worse. But the future of the city is not yet written, and the phrase almost impossible still contains within it the crucial word almost. What the story of the desert metropolis makes clear is that livability is not a fixed property of a place, but a dynamic balance, a constant negotiation between the demands of the environment and the capacity of human beings to meet them. For a long time, that balance in Phoenix tilted firmly toward the possible, the extreme heat held at bay by the miracle of cooling and the abundance of power and water. Now the balance is shifting, the environmental demands growing while the capacity to meet them comes under strain, and the margin that once seemed comfortable is narrowing. Whether the city remains livable depends on whether that margin can be preserved and rebuilt, on whether the adaptations can keep pace with the heat, on whether the power and the water can be secured, and above all, on whether the underlying warming that drives the whole crisis can be slowed and eventually halted. That last point is the deepest one, and it cannot be avoided. All the adaptation in the world, all the cooling centers and shade trees and reflective pavements, can only buy time against a heat that keeps growing more extreme. The adaptations treat the symptoms, and they are essential, but they do not address the underlying cause, which is the warming of the climate itself. If that warming continues unchecked, then the demands on the city will keep rising. And sooner or later, they may outstrip any possible capacity to meet them, and the almost will fall away, and impossible will become simply true. But if the warming can be slowed and turned around, then the intensifying pressure can be relieved, and the hottest city can remain a place where human beings not only survive, but live. The choice, in the end, is not really about Phoenix alone. It is about the trajectory of the warming that is reshaping the entire planet, and the desert city is simply the place where the consequences of that choice are arriving first and most starkly. America's hottest city is a warning written in heat and light, a message from the front line of a warming world about what is at stake and how much there is to lose. It tells us that the environments we have taken for granted are not guaranteed, that the balance that makes our cities livable can shift, and that the margin of safety we have relied upon is thinner than we knew. But it also tells us that the outcome is not yet fixed, that the word almost still stands, and that what happens next depends on the choices we make now, in this decade. While there is still time